When we talk about trauma, we almost always imagine something abrupt, intense, explicit. A serious accident, physical violence, a family tragedy. The kind of pain that leaves visible scars or stories that people immediately recognize as legitimate. But there is another kind of trauma, far more common, far more silent, that was never called by that name. The trauma of being a child and not being heard. The trauma of growing up feeling like love had to be earned. The trauma of living in an environment that seemed safe on the outside, but was emotionally unstable on the inside. And when pain is not named as trauma, it seeps into every corner of adult life without being noticed. It shapes beliefs, it influences decisions, it molds relationships, and above all, it repeats itself, because what goes unseen tends to return. This kind of trauma doesn't happen in a single event, but in small doses, diluted in daily life to the point it feels like part of what's normal. The father who never made eye contact, the mother who only praised when there was achievement, the silence after an attempt to express something, the comparison to a sibling, the subtle dismissal of vulnerability. They're tiny cracks that pile up until the internal structure begins to collapse. And even when everything seems to be in order, home, school, clean clothes, warm meals, something inside quietly breaks. There's no scream, no blood, no headline, but there is pain. And the cruelest part, it's a pain no one recognizes, not even the one who feels it. That's why so many people grow up believing they never suffered trauma. My childhood was normal. My parents did their best. I have nothing to complain about. These phrases, often partially true, conceal a learned denial. Not because there's a lie, but because there was omission. Trauma doesn't need to be an explosion. Sometimes it's the accumulation of crumbs, of abandonment, rejection, dismissal, demands, pieces of pain that were never picked up, just swept under an emotional rug no one looks under, until one day you trip over it. And it's in that stumble that many adults begin to realize they carry something unresolved, a chronic anxiety, an irrational fear of making mistakes, an overwhelming difficulty to trust, a relentless inner critic. And then comes the guilt. But why am I like this if nothing really bad happened to me? Because what happened, though small, was repeated. It was ignored. It was internalized. And the brain learned to survive by silencing what hurt, pretending it was nothing. Silent trauma is just that. It wasn't what was shouted at you. It was what you had to swallow alone. This understanding is the first step to redefining the word trauma. Making room to recognize that suffering doesn't need to be catastrophic to be real. That what shapes us isn't just the shocks, but also the voids. That absence of affection, of being heard, of being welcomed, also leaves a mark. That a childhood that worked too well may hide deep emotional deserts, and that it's possible to have had everything and still carry unhealed wounds. Because trauma, before being a wound on the body, is a rupture in the experience of feeling legitimate. And this almost always happens in silence. There are wounds that never bled, were never photographed, never left bruises, yet still shape the way someone sees themselves in the mirror. They are invisible scars born when a child is ignored in a moment of pain, when a teenager is mocked for being too sensitive, when an adult is told they're overreacting for sharing something that hurts. These are silent marks, embedded deep within the psyche, camouflaged by functional behavior and disguised behind automatic smiles. Scars that are never called wounds, but still ache every single day. They ache when trying to trust someone. They ache when receiving praise but not knowing how to accept it. They ache when a mistake is made and everything inside screams that it's unforgivable. These scars weren't born from a single traumatic event. They were carved through repetition. Repetition of judgmental stares, repetition of sarcastic remarks, repetition of absence, repetition of comparisons, demands, and disproportionate expectations. They form when a child learns that feeling is wrong, that crying is a weakness, that showing vulnerability is being less. They deepen each time pain is dismissed, fear is ridiculed, joy is interrupted by criticism, and the more subtle these episodes are, the harder it becomes to notice their leaving marks. Because the world teaches that what isn't visible isn't serious, and what isn't serious doesn't need attention, but the body doesn't forget, the heart even less. These wounds shape adults who live in a constant state of alert, people who seem strong, independent, efficient, but who feel deep inside an unexplainable emptiness, Adults who can't stand making mistakes, who avoid asking for help, who can't rest without guilt. People who live trying to be good enough, pleasant enough, productive enough, because at some point in life they learned that only by being useful would they be accepted. And the most tragic part is that many don't even know it. They just keep living as if that were the only way to exist, meeting expectations, carrying burdens, silencing pain. The environment around them rarely sees this pain, because everything looks fine, because there's no chaos, because there's a stable life, a built career, an organized routine. But behind that facade are sleepless nights, silent anxiety attacks, fragile relationships, difficulty feeling like they belong, and a persistent sense that something is missing, even when everything seems okay on the surface. That is the scar of invisible trauma. It doesn't stop life, but it robs you of fullness. It doesn't paralyze, but it steals joy. It doesn't destroy, but it slowly consumes. The greatest challenge with these wounds is that they're rarely validated. The person themselves feels guilty for having them. They think they're exaggerating, that they have everything, so they shouldn't feel this way. And that self-invalidation only reinforces the trauma. The pain that was once ignored is now ignored again by the victim themselves. That's why recognizing these scars is an act of courage. It's about no longer comparing yourself to those who suffered more. It's accepting that what hurts hurts, that what pained you, that what shaped you didn't have to be a tragedy to be traumatic, and that your pain doesn't have to compete with anyone else's to be legitimate. It only needs to be heard. Long before we could name what we were feeling, we were already being shaped by environments, gestures, and silences. Childhood, though often remembered fondly, may have been the stage for deep tensions that rational memory can't grasp. But the body, the mind, and behavior carry them for decades. There doesn't need to be yelling, nor fights, nor obvious abandonment. Subtle absences are enough. Demands disguised as encouragement are enough. Conditional praise, the look of disappointment, the promise of love only when there's achievement, these are enough. That's how an invisible field of tension is built, where the child learns they can't simply be, they have to prove. In many homes, pain doesn't scream, but it pulses quietly in phrases like, "Be strong, don't make a scene, this is nothing. Look how someone else can and you can't." It pulses in looks of contempt when vulnerability is shown, in cold scoldings in the face of fear, in laughter when sadness is confessed. It also pulses in environments where no one ever talked about emotions, where people ate, studied, played, but never cried in front of each other. It pulses in the emotional distance of parents who were physically present but emotionally unreachable. In homes like these, love may have existed, but not emotional support. The structure may have been solid, but true listening was non-existent. And it is in this emotional vacuum that silent trauma takes root. A child who grows up without emotional listening learns to doubt their own feelings. They learn to hide what they feel so they don't become a burden. So they're not seen as too much, so they're not called weak. They become experts at detecting expectations, pleasing adults, avoiding conflict. Early on, they develop emotional intelligence, not to serve themselves, but to manage others. They learn to keep the peace, even if it costs them their own spontaneity. And in doing so, they move further and further away from their true self, not because they wanted to, but because they had to survive emotionally in that environment. The cruelest part is that this process is rarely recognized as trauma. Because the child wasn't beaten, because they had food, school, toys, because the parents did their best. And that's true, but it doesn't erase the emptiness left by what wasn't there. No one held their fear. No one named their anger. No one taught them that sadness isn't weakness. No one allowed them to be vulnerable without punishment, and that no one becomes an internal, rigid voice that follows them into adulthood, saying over and over, "It's not that serious. Stop crying. You have to handle it." Many adults today live under the command of that voice. They're still trying to be good sons, good partners, good professionals, all in pursuit of a kind of love that never came, or that only came when they were behaving the right way. And even if they've distanced themselves from their families, that emotional programming remains active, because it's not just about what happened back then, it's about what was learned about themselves, about what they must be to deserve affection, about how much they can, or can't, trust those around them, about how worthy they are of being loved just for existing. Becoming aware of this isn't about blaming parents. It's about freeing the child still living on high alert, still trying to prove they are worthy of love. It's about looking at childhood with honest and sensitive eyes, ones capable of recognizing not only the joyful moments but also the empty spaces. Because only then can we recover the parts of ourselves that were left behind, frozen in time, still waiting, for a hug that never came, for a validation that never happened, for a "it's okay to feel this" that was never said. The greatest challenge of invisible traumas is that they learn how to disguise themselves. They camouflage as routine. They fit into social norms. They hide behind phrases that cancel out any emotional discomfort. Everyone went through that. It wasn't that bad. My parents did what they could. At least I had a home. Pain gets diluted in justifications, rationalizations, comparisons, and slowly legitimate suffering is turned into silence, into shame, into guilt for feeling something that shouldn't be felt. This is the normalization of silent pain, a process that turns traumatic experiences into obligations of gratitude. From an early age, society teaches us that only those who've suffered a lot deserve attention. A lot, truly. As if pain needed a certificate to be validated. If there was no physical abuse, no complete abandonment, no obvious tragedy, then what you feel is drama. This discourse, repeated in schools, families, and social media, builds a culture of comparing suffering, as if it were a competition over who has the right to feel bad. Those who had violent parents have trauma. Those with overly demanding parents do not. Those who lost everything suffer. Those who had a childhood full of subtle pressure are just whining. This is not only unfair, it's inhumane, because each nervous system responds in its own way. Each sensitivity has its limit, and every pain deserves to be seen with respect. The result is an army of emotionally wounded adults trying to lead functional lives while carrying wounds that no one sees. People who suffer in silence, afraid of seeming ungrateful, who don't seek help because they believe others suffered more, who blame themselves for having everything, yet still feeling empty, who try to compensate for that emptiness with performance, with success, with control. But silent pain isn't healed through productivity. It only begins to dissolve when it is finally acknowledged as real. This normalization of pain also happens internally. The person themselves learns to doubt what they feel, to downplay the discomfort, to rationalize excessively, to turn emotional pain into statistics, as if that made it less real. I know people are starving, so I can't complain about my anxiety. But pain is not about deserving, it's about impact. And what impacts us is not only what happened, but what didn't happen, the hug that was missing, the listening that never came, the emotional space that was always denied. In this context, silence is the greatest enemy of healing, because what isn't named can't be treated, and what is constantly invalidated becomes an emotional knot that's hard to untangle. That's why the normalization of pain is such a dangerous phenomenon. It perpetuates trauma. It prevents people from asking for help. It creates an entire society of people who seem fine on the outside but bleed on the inside. And the cruelest part, many don't even know they're wounded. They think the weight they carry is just normal, that this constant dissatisfaction, this vague sadness, this fear of not being enough, is part of adult life. But it isn't. It's the echo of old wounds that were never seen, much less healed. Recognizing this pain, naming it, is not playing the victim. It's setting yourself free. It's interrupting a cycle of silence and emotional repression passed down through generations. It's making room to feel what once had to be swallowed. It's saying, what I went through was real and it had consequences. And that alone is enough to begin healing, because pain that is finally heard already begins to transform. Few pains are as persistent as the feeling of never being enough. No matter how much you do, achieve, try, or mold yourself, the sense of always falling short remains. This wound begins early, often inside family environments that, even without intending to, create a constant pressure, silent comparisons, or expectations far beyond what a child can bear. The trauma of being almost enough isn't shouted, it's implied. It's in the tone of voice when you get a 9 but they expected a 10. It's in the way a sibling or cousin gets praised while you hear silence. It's in the selective applause, the conditional hugs, the looks that say more than words. And over time, that child begins to believe they'll only be loved if they're perfect, that they'll only be seen if they stand out, that they'll only be accepted if they hide parts of themselves. This trauma is deceptive because, on the outside, many of these people seem highly successful. They are dedicated, driven, responsible. They're the ones who make others proud, who do everything right, who rarely make mistakes. But inside, they live in a constant war, a war against their own self-criticism, against the ever-present sense of inadequacy, against the paralyzing fear of failure. Because for them, failure isn't just a mistake. It's the loss of the little love they managed to earn. Love that always came as a reward, never as a right. Love that felt like a trophy, not comfort. And so even as adults, they keep chasing a recognition that never truly arrives. Because even when it comes, it's never enough. The mind that grew up in this environment never rests. It watches, it compares, it anticipates rejection. It tries to predict everything that might go wrong. Because almost enough was interpreted as a threat of abandonment. And emotional abandonment, even if subtle, was so painful that now everything is done to avoid it. So this person becomes hyper-productive, hyper-pleasing, hyper-vigilant, not by choice, but for survival. Because the child they once were still lives inside, desperate to prove their worth, to earn a kind of affection that was never unconditional. This silent pain contaminates every aspect of adult life. At work, there's a toxic perfectionism that leads to burnout. In relationships, there's a constant fear of not being enough for the other, or of being abandoned as soon as they show a flaw. In personal life, there's self-sabotage disguised as humility. The person refuses to celebrate achievements, believes they don't deserve rest, that they haven't done enough yet. And this endless self-demand becomes identity. They no longer know who they are without the pressure to be good. And the saddest part, sometimes when they finally pause, they feel guilty, because they were trained to believe their worth lies in performance, not in existence. Healing this wound begins with something very simple, yet deeply difficult: admitting that it exists, admitting it's not weakness, it's not drama, it's not selfish to wish you had been loved without needing to perform. Yes, it hurts to have never heard you are enough just as you are. Yes, there is a longing for that genuine, unconditional, expectation-free affection. And yes, that absence left scars. Only after recognizing this can one begin to build a new relationship with oneself, a relationship that is more compassionate, more human, more honest, where worth is not tied to doing, but to simply being alive. There is no healing without truth, and the truth in this case is harsh. Many people grew up trying to be perfect because they never felt fully loved. They grew up hearing they had everything to succeed, but no space to fail. They grew up being called so mature, when in truth they were just exhausted from trying to please. They grew up being praised for the masks, but ignored when showing their real face. And now, as adults, they must dismantle all of that, not to destroy what they've built, but to finally be able to breathe, to exist without fear, to be, for the first time, enough, just to be. Some people never stop. They're always busy, always solving things, always available. They're the ones others admire for their strength, intelligence, and efficiency. But behind the flawless performance, there's an uncomfortable truth. Hyperfunctionality is often a trauma response, not a sign of emotional health, but a desperate attempt to maintain control. Because if I do everything right, if I anticipate everything, if I never let anything fail, maybe, just maybe, I won't have to face the pain that's still buried inside. The mask of hyperfunctionality is heavy, shiny on the outside and suffocating on the inside. It was created to protect, but at the same time, it traps. That mask starts forming early, when the child realizes that expressing emotions isn't safe, that feeling too much bothers others, that making mistakes disappoints, that being vulnerable brings shame. So instead of crying, the child helps. Instead of shouting, they solve. Instead of collapsing, they smile. The hyperfunctional child grows up too fast, learns to sense what others need, becomes a conflict mediator, a comforting shoulder, a walking solution. And behind all that competence lies a deep, unmet need that was silenced too early. A child who was never cared for, but learned to care, not out of maturity, but out of necessity. When that child becomes an adult, the same logic remains. They fill every space with productivity. They fill their time with tasks. They take on responsibilities that aren't theirs, and the more they do, the more they are praised. The more they solve, the more they are valued. But it comes at a cost. They no longer know who they are outside of being useful. Rest brings guilt. Compliments trigger suspicion. Free affection feels strange, because they've grown used to being loved for what they give, not for what they feel. And that creates a crushing kind of loneliness, being surrounded by people who admire you but don't truly see you. Hyperfunctionality is the most socially accepted form of emotional suffering. It is applauded, it is promoted, it is romanticized. But inside, these people are exhausted. They don't know how to say no. They have hidden anxiety attacks. They suffer from insomnia, chronic pain, hormonal imbalances. They have an inner voice that says if they stop, everything will fall apart. Because stopping means facing what they've avoided for so long, the original pain, the feeling of not being enough, the fear of abandonment, the shame of simply being human. This mask is hard to remove because it produced results. It built careers, supported families, organized lives, but it also hid the pain. And healing begins when we admit that functioning well doesn't always mean being well, that handling everything might be a warning sign, not a strength. That excessive responsibility can be an unconscious attempt to make up for something that was missing, and that no one should have to carry the world just to prove they deserve to exist. True strength isn't about never failing. It's about being able to fail and still feel worthy. It's about being able to rest without guilt. It's about being able to say, I don't know, I can't, not today, and still be loved. It's about being seen beyond results, about being, not just doing. And for those who've lived for years behind the mask of hyperfunctionality, that's the greatest challenge, believing it's possible to exist without performing. And that even then, love is still waiting on the other side. There are pains that the mind forgets, but the body never stops carrying. Even when we can't explain the reason behind constant exhaustion, chronic muscle tension, persistent insomnia, or a racing heart in simple situations, the body continues trying to tell a story that the mind was taught to silence. The trauma that was never named, that was ignored or overly rationalized, turns into physical symptoms, as if the body took on the task of expressing what the conscious mind could no longer bear to feel. This is the trauma body, the body that speaks when the soul was forced into silence. Many people who've suffered cumulative microtraumas present symptoms that defy conventional diagnosis. Back pain, frequent migraines, digestive issues, extreme fatigue with no medical explanation, panic attacks that arise without any clear trigger. These are real, limiting symptoms, often dismissed as dramatization or just stress, when in truth, they're somatized emotional memories. Because what couldn't be lived emotionally ends up crystallizing physically. The body does not lie. It warns us day after day that something needs to be faced. Emotionally neglected childhoods, silent toxic relationships, constant performance pressure, lack of emotional support. All of these leave neurological imprints. The nervous system adapts to a hostile environment by creating ongoing alertness, hypervigilance, and sensory disconnection. Cortisol levels rise. Adrenaline becomes normalized. The mind detaches from the body just to cope. But the body feels, the body remembers, the body stores it all. And one day it responds. Sometimes with a crisis, sometimes with collapse, sometimes with illnesses that defy objective explanation, but carry immense subjective history. This isn't about blaming trauma for every illness, but recognizing that the emotional body and the physical body are interconnected. Our emotions aren't just thoughts, they're biological processes. When an intense emotion is experienced and repressed, it doesn't vanish, it transforms. It takes up residence somewhere, and the body, generously, takes on the task of holding it until it no longer can. Then it begins to cry out, not with words but with symptoms, with fatigue, with pain, with hormonal imbalances, with physical blockages that make no clinical sense, but perfect historical sense. Recognizing this is the beginning of a new kind of listening, a listening that goes beyond reason and taps into sensitivity, a listening that doesn't just aim to treat the symptom, but seeks to understand what it represents. The body asks for pause when the soul has been pushed too hard. The body asks for rest when the emotional self has lived through years of war. The body asks for care when it never received comfort. And often, the therapeutic process begins exactly there, in the physical discomfort that forces someone to stop, to look within, to finally feel. Validating this connection between trauma and the body is a revolutionary act of care. It means letting go of the idea that everything can be fixed with willpower alone. It means understanding that the body is on our side, trying to protect, to warn, to save. And when it falls ill, maybe it's not failing, maybe it's asking to be heard. Because in the end, the body has always known what the mind had to forget to survive. And now, with more safety and awareness, it's time to remember, not to suffer all over again, but to finally be free. Few experiences are as devastating as feeling real pain and finding no one who validates it. When sadness is ignored, when fear is minimized, when suffering is compared and diminished, a deep wound opens. The wound of feeling that what hurts you doesn't matter to anyone else. The wound of non-recognition doesn't arise from the absence of explicit love, but from the absence of emotional attention. It forms when, as a child or teenager, you tried to express what you felt and were met with silence, judgment, or correction. When your attempt to be heard ended in guilt, when your tears were called drama, when your exhaustion was seen as laziness, when your anxiety was ridiculed as exaggeration, and when, in response to your pain, someone said, "But you have everything." That phrase, "but you have everything," acts like a mirror that erases the face of the one who suffers, as if having a home, food, school, and family invalidated any inner pain, as if material context cancelled out emotional experience. That's how many learn to silence what they feel, because they feel ashamed, because they feel ungrateful, because they internalize the belief that they're complaining over nothing. And with that, they stop trusting their own pain. They stop trusting themselves. The wound of non-recognition is also a wound of identity. It erodes the right to feel, and without that right, it's impossible to live fully. In adulthood, this wound reveals itself in silence, in conversations that never start, in tears that don't fall, in words that never find the courage to be spoken. It also shows up in the desperate search for someone who finally sees, a partner, a therapist, a friend, anyone with attentive eyes and generous ears. But even when that someone appears, the wound makes it hard to open up, because the expectation of not being understood has become the norm, because rejection was so often repeated that now it's anticipated. And so, even when there is kindness, fear arises. Will they think I'm exaggerating? Am I forcing this pain? Will they see me as weak? That fear is the echo of a pain that was never acknowledged. Another frequent symptom of this wound is the tendency to become everyone's caregiver, but never the one who is cared for. The person learns to erase themselves, to listen to everyone, to be strong for others. And when, for just a moment, they think of asking for help, they feel shame, or feel like a burden, or think others have it worse, and they go back to silence, back to performing, back to the role of always managing everything. This dynamic is cruel because it reinforces isolation. And it started long ago, when the child was left talking to themselves, when they had to comfort their own pain, when they learned their suffering wasn't anyone's priority. Giving a name to this wound is the beginning of rewriting your own story. It's saying to yourself, what I felt was real even if no one saw it. It's recognizing that pain needs witnesses. That denied suffering turns into symptoms, into patterns, into self-abandonment. That being validated is not a luxury. It's a basic human need. And that now, even if late, it's possible to offer yourself the gaze that was missing, the listening that never came, the affection that was denied. Recognizing the wound of non-recognition is paradoxically the beginning of the recognition that was missing. It is a rescue, a repair, a gesture of self-love. Because when you validate your own pain, it no longer needs to scream, because it has finally been heard. When affection was conditional, when care came with demands, when love was delivered alongside criticism, silence, or pressure, growing up starts to mean searching everywhere for what wasn't given at the start. This is one of the most painful legacies of emotional microtraumas, the relentless search for safe love, even without knowing exactly what that means. And this search isn't rational, it's visceral. It unfolds through gestures, choices, and recurring bonds, even when they hurt. Because the emotional brain recognizes patterns, and if it learned that love comes through instability, it will spend a lifetime trying to recreate it, sometimes to fix it, sometimes because it's familiar, but always hoping, deep down, that someone will finally provide what was missing. That's why so many adults with a history of microtraumas end up in relationships where they feel the same subtle abandonment they once felt in childhood, or the same constant fear of making mistakes, or the same exhausting obligation to please just to avoid being rejected. And over time, these patterns become nearly invisible. The person thinks they are loving, but in reality, they are emotionally surviving, trying to make sure that, this time, love doesn't leave, that this time they won't be abandoned when they show who they really are. And so they adapt, they mold themselves, they give more than they can, they accept less than they deserve, all in the name of a love that deep down never feels safe. This relational insecurity isn't weakness nor neediness. It's a direct reflection of what was lived in the early years. Those who learned they had to do everything right to be loved develop a chronic fear of failure. Those who are constantly compared live in a state of inferiority. Those who are never listened to feel the need to scream or stay silent forever. And those who were emotionally neglected internalize the idea that they should settle for less. And so love, what should be a healing space, often becomes a stage for trauma repetition, a mirror that reflects what was once lived, not what is truly desired. This desperate search also shows up in contradictory behaviors, fear of surrendering and fear of being alone, longing for intimacy and panic at being seen, a deep desire to be visible and immediate retreat when finally noticed. Because secure love requires a kind of openness that was never learned. It requires vulnerability, it requires trust, it requires silent presence without judgment, and for someone who only knew fragile bonds, that feels dangerously foreign. So they hesitate, they test, they sabotage, or they cling with overwhelming force, all to avoid reliving the original abandonment. But this is exactly where the path to healing begins. Realizing that safe love isn't a miracle that comes from others. It's a structure we build from within. It means learning to offer ourselves what we lacked, to validate ourselves, to hold ourselves, to say it's okay to feel afraid without self-judgment, to not abandon ourselves in moments of pain, because the more we practice this self-holding, the more the body understands it is safe, and the more relationships stop being battlefields and become places of rest. Safe love isn't perfection, it's presence, it's consistency, it's the freedom to exist without performing. And for someone who spent a lifetime trying to earn love, discovering that it can come simply because you exist, without effort, without masks, without control, is both terrifying and liberating. But it's possible, and it begins by believing that you are worthy, not because you're enough, but because you are human. There are adults who live tired, not the kind of tiredness that a weekend can fix, not the physical fatigue from working too much, but an ancestral, deep, emotional exhaustion, a tiredness that lives in the bones, in the gaze, in the soul. It's the tiredness of someone who grew up monitoring their own behavior to avoid disappointing others, someone who learned to measure words, to anticipate reactions, to be the adult in the house while still being a child. It's the tiredness of someone who never truly had the right to rest in the deepest sense, to be present within themselves, to relax their shoulders, to trust their surroundings, to release control. Those who never had this emotional right grow up with a restless mind, a body always on alert, and a nervous system that doesn't know what peace feels like. These adults live driven by performance. Even when no one is pressuring them anymore, they continue pressuring themselves. They wake up with the weight of what hasn't been done. They go to sleep with guilt over what they didn't manage to complete. And in rare moments of pause, they feel anxious. They feel empty. They feel an inexplicable discomfort that pushes them back into the cycle of hyperactivity. Because resting for these people triggers emotional memories of threat. When the mind slows down, the inner voices grow louder. When the body tries to stop, the nervous system goes into overdrive. And what should bring relief becomes a trigger. So they go back to rushing, back to doing, back to producing. Not out of conscious choice, but out of emotional survival. This mode of functioning is so deeply ingrained that even after therapy, even after self-awareness and deep reflection, relapses happen. Relapses that are not failures, but the body's way of trying to protect itself. Suddenly, the person finds themselves exhausted again, anxious again, alone again, crying in secret again, asking themselves, "Why am I back here?" The answer isn't a lack of strength, it's the depth of the wound. Because the inner child, even in adulthood, still fears rejection, still fears disappointment, still believes they must do just a bit more to be worthy of love. Relapses don't mean that healing has failed. They mean the wound still needs care, that there's a part of you that was forgotten, ignored, overlooked, and that now it's asking to be seen again. The problem is that relapses often come with shame. The person feels weak, inconsistent, ungrateful, and they begin to judge themselves. They try to fix it all alone, again, but what they most need in that moment isn't a solution. It's comfort. It's listening. It's a space where they can exist without having to justify every tear. The adult who never got to rest needs, above all, to relearn how to stop without guilt, to stop without falling apart, to stop with tenderness. They need to rebuild within themselves a new reference for safety, one where love isn't tied to usefulness, one where mistakes aren't death sentences, one where exhaustion isn't a failure, but a sign that it's time to care for oneself. This doesn't happen overnight. It's a slow process, full of listening, of attempts, of gentleness, but each time they choose rest without self-criticism, something inside begins to realign. The relapse, then, transforms into a reunion with the part that still feels afraid, with the part that still longs for approval, with the part that still believes it must be stronger than everything. And when that part is met with kindness, it begins to trust, to lower its guard, to let go of the weight. Because finally someone, you, is saying, "You can stop now. You've done enough. You deserve to breathe." For someone who has spent a lifetime emotionally defending themselves, stepping into a therapy room can feel more terrifying than any public exposure. Because there, for the first time, you're invited to feel without having to justify it, to name pains that were never heard, to acknowledge emotions that had to be buried so you could keep functioning. Therapy isn't just a place to speak. It's above all a place to be heard. And for someone who has never truly been listened to, being heard can feel uncomfortable, almost unbearable. It's as if someone suddenly has direct access to an inner territory that was always guarded, armored, protected. But this is exactly where therapy's transformative power lies, in the creation of a space where it finally becomes possible to exist without performance. For years, many people learn to deal with pain by denying it. They rationalize, they minimize, they compare it to others' suffering just to conclude theirs is nothing. In therapy, this mechanism begins to break down. The question, "How did that make you feel?" might sound simple, but it's devastating when, for the first time, it's not followed by judgment. And when the answer comes, it isn't interrupted, it isn't corrected, it isn't dismissed. The therapist is not there to doubt your pain or rush your healing, they are there to witness. And for someone who has lived a life of invalidation, that is an act of redemption, a reunion with the part of themselves that learned to stay silent. Therapy also teaches a new emotional language, a language that is not learned in households where feelings were ignored or treated as weakness. Words like anger, anguish, fear, frustration, and need begin to take shape. And more than that, they begin to be allowed, because in that room, there is no punishment for feeling. There is no rejection for being vulnerable. There is no abandonment when pain is shown. That slowly begins to reconfigure the emotional system. The body starts to understand it no longer needs to be on high alert. The mind begins to accept it doesn't need to solve everything alone. And the soul starts to glimpse a new way of existing, with less rigidity, less pressure, less fear. Of course, the process is not linear. There is resistance. There are days when silence takes over, sessions when everything feels blocked, weeks when old patterns come back in full force. But even that is therapeutic, because there, for the first time, it's possible to fail and still be welcomed, to regress and still be respected, to not know and still remain worthy. This kind of steady, respectful connection begins to internally reprogram what was once lived as emotional instability. And little by little, the therapeutic relationship becomes an internal model of safety, a new reference that begins to expand into other areas of life. The goal of therapy is not to erase the past, but to give it new meaning, Not to turn pain into forced gratitude, but to allow that pain to have a place, to integrate it into your narrative, no longer silencing it, to let it stop being a ghost that haunts and become a scar that tells a story of survival. Therapy doesn't promise everything will be better in a few sessions, but it offers something even more valuable, a real path of reconnection with yourself, a space to relearn how to feel, to ask, to receive, and above all, to rest within your own existence, without needing to earn it all the time. There comes a moment in the emotional journey when pain, silently, stops being just a passing sensation and begins to occupy the very center of identity. It's when suffering, once situational like a difficult childhood, an absence, an abandonment, or constant criticism, becomes the lens through which a person sees themselves, not by choice, but by the absence of another reference. When someone spends years without being heard, without validation, without unconditional affection, they end up building a psychological structure around the wound. And if the wound is all they've ever known, it becomes home. It becomes a name. It becomes the only way they know how to exist in the world. In this state, suffering stops being just a symptom. It becomes a story. The person begins to define themselves by their pain. I'm anxious. I'm insecure. I'm the one who always gets it wrong. I'm the one who's never chosen. And the more this narrative is repeated, the more it solidifies. Not because it's a lie, but because it was the only way the emotional system found to make sense of its own history. The pain isn't just pain. It becomes structure, and letting go of it would mean giving up something that, though it hurts, feels familiar. Trauma becomes identity because without it, there's a void. There's a terrifying question: who am I if I'm not this wound? This process is even more subtle when the pain begins to be recognized by others. The person who has suffered greatly starts to be seen as strong, a warrior, resilient. And with that, they receive affection, attention, even admiration. But that recognition, when it only comes through pain, becomes a trap. Because now there's a reason to keep suffering. It's how they feel loved. It's how they are seen. It's how they feel they belong. So even when healing begins, guilt follows. Even when they move forward, they self-sabotage. Because deep down, something whispers, if I get better, maybe no one will see me anymore. This emotional trap is delicate because it's not about playing the victim. It's about survival. Pain is what held the person together for years. It justified their reactions, their silences, their defenses. It explained why they didn't open up, why they didn't trust, why they were so guarded. So letting it go isn't simple. It requires courage. It requires new references. It requires building from scratch a new way of being that doesn't depend on the wound. An identity that acknowledges the trauma, but is not reduced to it. This transition begins slowly, when the person allows themselves to feel joy without guilt, when they rest without needing to justify it, when they realize they are also made of beauty, of affection, of strength, not only pain. That's when identity begins to expand. The wound is still there, but it no longer rules. The memory remains, but it no longer defines. The fear exists, but it no longer paralyzes. And little by little the narrative shifts, from I am what was hurt to I am who survived, and later to something even greater. I am despite everything. Freeing oneself from pain as identity is not about forgetting what happened. It's about allowing other parts of you to take up space. It's about making room for lightness, for affection, for the creation of new stories, because no one was born to be only a scar. There is within each of us a being that never stopped existing. It was simply covered by pain, and now, little by little, it begins to breathe. It begins to live. It begins to remember that it's possible to be whole, even after being broken. When we talk about grief, we almost always think of tangible losses: the death of someone, the end of a relationship, the loss of a job. But there is a kind of silent, hidden, and deeply valid grief that is rarely acknowledged. The grief for what never happened. The grief for a childhood that wasn't light, for the comfort that never came, for the conversations that never existed, for the protection you deserved but never received, for the affection that was promised but never delivered. This grief is confusing because it has no visible object. There's no body to bury, no goodbye to be said, no ceremony to mark the loss. There's only a void left where presence should have existed, a hollow left by absences that no one ever admitted. This kind of grief cuts deeply because, most of the time, It is invalidated even by those who feel it. But my parents were there. But I wasn't mistreated. But I had everything. These socially acceptable statements hide a brutal truth. It is possible to have structure and still have been emotionally neglected. It is possible to have received food but never been listened to. It is possible to have had a house but never had a home. And when these absences are finally recognized, what surfaces isn't just pain, it's revolt, it's deep sorrow, it's disorientation. Because admitting that something essential was missing means rewriting your own story. It means looking back and seeing with adult eyes what the child could not yet understand. This grief is also difficult because there are no clear culprits. Sometimes the parents did the best they could. Sometimes they were dealing with their own wounds. Sometimes the environment was too functional to allow for any softness. And still, something was missing. Still, it hurt. Still, the child had to adapt in order to survive. And now, the adult must allow themselves to mourn. Not to blame, but to release. To let go of the fantasy that everything was fine. To stop justifying what was never enough. To finally say, I deserved more. Because saying that is the first step in giving yourself more now. Grieving what never was requires emotional courage. It destabilizes. It shakes old foundations. It challenges long-held memories. But it's also deeply liberating. Because while that grief is not felt, we live trying to compensate, trying to pull from other relationships what was missing in the first ones, trying all the time to earn the love that should have been unconditional. Grief, in this case, breaks the cycle. It allows the wound to breathe. It recognizes that there was loss, and that this loss shaped who you are. But it doesn't have to define you anymore. It is in this process that the possibility of internal repair is born. When you accept there was no embrace, you begin to build your own. When you admit that there was no one to listen, you learn to hear yourself more attentively. When you recognize that no one protected you, you begin to protect yourself. It's not about denying the past, but about letting it rest in the place where it no longer commands. Because what was lost doesn't need to be endlessly sought. It can be mourned, and then replaced with something new. Something that comes from you, for you. This silent grief, when faced with honesty and care, returns to the soul a lightness it didn't even know it had lost. It makes space for feeling things beyond pain. And most importantly, it gives you permission to live the present with less self-criticism, less repetition, and less expectation of fixing what was broken. Because some things don't get fixed, they get mourned, and after that, they get released. There is a moment in the healing process when something deeply symbolic occurs, the reunion with the self that was left behind. It's not about an idealized version, nor a magical transformation. It's about discovering or rediscovering the most authentic part of you, the part that existed before the masks, before the adaptations, before the demands that shaped your behavior and silenced your emotions, the self that was spontaneous, sensitive, curious, loving, the self that didn't need to justify its existence, that didn't strive to earn love. It simply was. This rebirth doesn't happen suddenly. It is delicate, gradual, almost imperceptible at first. But once it begins, it changes everything. Because for the first time you begin to live not from the wound, but from your essence. This process requires inner space. It demands that the rigidity of your defenses begins to soften, that your nervous system, once hypervigilant, allows moments of rest, that the silence left by pain makes room for the voice of desire. And desire here does not mean what others want from you, but what you truly want. The desire to laugh without fear, to cry without shame, to choose without guilt, to make mistakes without self-destruction, to love without losing yourself, to belong to yourself before you belong to anyone else. The authentic self is the one that holds all your versions, the wounded, the strong, the doubtful, the hopeful, and remains whole, because it no longer needs to be perfect. It just needs to be real. At this point, boundaries also begin to emerge. The no that once felt impossible becomes possible, even if it trembles on your lips. Tolerance for what hurts begins to fade. Patience with what wounds you dissolves. And this might scare those who were used to your shape-shifting self. Because the authentic self, though kind, is firm. Though sensitive, is powerful. Though open to the world, no longer self-abandons. And this new way of being, more authentic, more coherent, more present, starts attracting healthier relationships, more balanced dynamics, more nurturing environments. This rebirth, however, comes with loss. Some relationships won't survive your truth. Some patterns will unravel. Some idealizations will collapse, because the authentic self no longer sustains roles that cause harm, no longer performs to keep affection. And yes, that hurts. But it's a clean pain, a pain of growth, a pain that makes room, because what comes after is far greater. The freedom to live a life that makes sense to you. A life where you no longer have to emotionally mutilate yourself to fit in, where you don't have to hide your feelings to be loved. The rebirth of the authentic self isn't the end of pain, but it is the beginning of honesty, of presence, of genuine self-connection. And when that happens, even the difficult days feel different, because now there is internal ground. There is a center. There is a loving gaze turned inward. There is a shelter that no longer depends on anyone else. And that's what sustains the healing path, knowing that no matter what happens, you won't abandon yourself again. This version of you, now beginning to breathe more freely, has always been there, waiting, silent, forgotten, but alive. And now, after everything that has been felt, processed, and named, it can finally step out of the shadows and claim its place. The place of someone who is no longer just a consequence of pain, but the protagonist of a new story. What remains unnamed remains unanchored, without form, without place, without validation. And that is precisely why so many emotional wounds continue to operate silently, repeating patterns, shaping choices, sabotaging relationships. When pain doesn't receive a name, it's not recognized as real. It turns into confusion, into guilt, into a discomforting sense of always being on the margins of yourself. Naming pain, then, is more than an act of understanding. It is an act of liberation. It is the moment when what was vague becomes concrete. What was suffocated becomes audible. What was invisible becomes legitimate. Many people carry pain for decades without ever daring to describe it, because it felt like an exaggeration, because no one validated it, because it seemed like it was just in their head, because it wasn't that bad. But when for the first time someone says out loud that was neglect, that was emotional invasion, that was abandonment, that was a wound, something reorganizes inside. Confusion gives way to clarity. Emotional chaos begins to take shape. And with that comes a silent relief, the certainty that it wasn't madness, that it wasn't weakness, that what hurt really hurt and deserves care. Naming pain doesn't mean sinking into it. It means being able to look it in the eye, to say, I know what you are and where you came from. Only then can you set it aside when it no longer serves you. Because while pain has no name, it seeps into everything. It becomes reactivity, becomes self-demand, becomes withdrawal, becomes emotional dependence, becomes hyperfunctionality. But when it is acknowledged, it settles. It doesn't disappear, but it finds a place from which it no longer controls you. It becomes just one part of the story, not the center of it. This naming process can happen in therapy, in deep conversations, in writing, in meditative silence. The form doesn't matter. What matters is the intention, to look honestly within and give language to what was felt. When you say, this hurt me, you create space for healing. When you say, this was missing, you create space for repair. When you say, this left a mark, you are allowing yourself to heal. Language is a bridge between pain and healing. Without it, we remain stuck in the fog of symptoms. With it, we can cross into awareness. Naming pain also transforms relationships. It allows you to set boundaries with clarity, to say, this hurts me, instead of simply walking away. To say, this reminds me of something old, instead of reacting impulsively. To ask for help more assertively. To accept affection without suspicion, because now you know where your feelings come from. And someone who knows what they feel is no longer a prisoner of their inner world. They become responsible for it. And that changes everything. In the end, every healing journey begins at this point, when pain finds words. Because when something is named, it stops being a faceless monster. It becomes something that can be cared for, understood, integrated, and over time, transcended. You don't have to forget what happened. You don't have to erase the scars. But you do have to call them by their rightful name, because only then will they stop screaming. Only then will you stop living in their shadow. Only then can you finally live Truly.